Welcome to Innovation in Energy, the final panel of the 2008 MIT Energy Conference. We saved the best for last. No offense. My name is Varun Dhanuka. I'm a first-year MBA student and the panel lead. Our moderator today is the chair of MIT Sloan School of Management's Technological Innovation and Entrepreneurship Group. He is actively involved in many aspects of technology management, including technology strategy, corporate venturing, product innovation, and technology-based entrepreneurship. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ed Roberts.
Thank you very much. It's really quite exciting to be here in the finale session of such a spectacular conference. And I think that before we turn to anything else, we really need to praise the student organizers and participants for the wonderful job that they've done in pulling this whole thing off. This was an all-MIT presentation from students across the entire institute, and I think those of us who are faculty are proud, as we always are, of the kinds of jobs that the students here are able to do in all realms. This last session is a session which, by title, is a challenge. Now, my full-time job, or my day job, is that I'm supposed to take leadership in the area of educating and stimulating the students around here to become entrepreneurial and to innovate in significant ways. And during the last several years, innovation in the energy area has been one of the most exciting growth areas across all of MIT. Before we turn to those who have the answers as to what is essential to make innovation in this area successful, i.e. my three distinguished panelists, I thought that I would just add a bit to the burden that they have to carry with them in their prepared remarks or unprepared remarks or responses to you by giving you a slight synopsis of some of the things that I've noticed during the past several years about energy. The first thing I've noticed is that we seem to have a significant dependency that's been changing and worsening in regard to oil. It used to be that we only had to worry about the instability of our availability of sources of supply of oil from one segment of the world, controlled by one particular group of people. We now find in the last few years that the Arab Middle East has been joined by authoritarian regimes in Venezuela and in Russia, all of whom have decided to expand their piece of the action with respect to making those of us wanting oil a bit more and more uneasy as to its availability and supply. Last night I went through to Google and I looked up a whole series. That was a plug for a gentleman in the corner. And I looked up a variety of things about the oil scene over the last 50 years. And whether you realize it or not, oil prices until just a few years ago have been running under real prices as they were some 35 years ago. That real prices for oil were higher 35 years ago than almost at any point until the last 5 years. So we've had something happen in the last 5 years or so, not much more than that, that's changed dramatically the supply-demand situation in oil. And you can have whatever explanation you choose, but certainly one of the things that you have to appreciate is the rather dramatic rise of demand by China, by India, by the developing world, for which we in general should feel very good and thankful that there is a basis for economic growth and development. But the consequence has been that we have had dramatic increase in the demand for energy supply. And what is noteworthy, if you look at oil, is we have not had a comparable increase in the supply. Within the United States, supply has gone down. Within non-OPEC nations, supply has gone up by less than 10%. within OPEC, supply has gone up by less than 10%. So we've had a situation in which increase of supply has not met increase in demand, and we've got an oil problem. Secondly, we have a problem within the United States about our energy alternatives. Through the influence of Midwest congressmen, plus one of the most unethical corporations in America, we have managed to warp the priorities of the United States towards supporting research and development and deployment of corn ethanol. Not a very wise choice. And almost any other choice would be better, but we are now spending priority and dollars on pursuing a mistaken alternative, an area where maybe some of the panelists would like to question. Thirdly, we have, despite the speaker last night who told us that only 2% of the future demand for energy could be supplied by nuclear power, we have chosen in this country, for political reasons, to ignore the potential that nuclear power may indeed be an important contributor. Indeed, the one country in the West that we have belittled for so many years in terms of its innovative capabilities, France, is the only country in the West that has thoughtfully approached nuclear power and has brought it to the point that it provides 75% of the energy needs of the country, something that perhaps the United States could learn from their French neighbors. And finally, I'm interested in solar energy because clearly solar energy is unlimited in terms of its potential. And in 1972, I became the independent director of one of the first photovoltaic companies in the United States, a company in Braintree called Solar Power Corporation. It failed very quickly in 1972, failed by 1974, but the important thing that I remember from that time period is that we had optimistic beliefs that we were only 10 years away from having solar power available in a manner that would be competitive with the cost of electricity in the main grid. I hear today similar optimistic claims, and I wonder whether indeed it may be another 30 or 40 years before we again hear similar optimistic claims as to when it will be that solar energy will become competitive. So I just wanted to add these issues to the concerns of our panel as they start to move forward with solutions to the problems. And I am delighted that the first problem solver that we're going to be able to have speak with you today is a man who has had great experiences in solving a wide variety of challenging problems of society and of this country as well as of industry. As you know from the materials you have on our speakers, James Woolsey has had a long and distinguished career in and out of Washington, in and out of industry and the like. Today, he is of counsel at Goodwin Procter, one of our important sponsors of this program, which we appreciate, and he is now a venture partner at Vantage Point Ventures. So we are delighted that our first speaker is James Woolsey. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. Well, I was, of course, honored to be asked to be here today, but to tell you the truth, since I spent 22 years as a Washington lawyer, and then I spent some time out at the CIA in the Clinton administration, I'm actually honored to be invited into any polite company for any purpose at all. Let me see if I can parse the set of issues that Ed mentioned by saying that I think there are two kinds of overarching, in some cases existential problems that we have with energy these days. Malignant and malevolent. By malignant, I mean problems nobody is trying to cause, but that are getting worse and face the possibility of exponential bad change as a result of unintended consequences. One, of course, is climate change. Because the melting of the tundra, the instability of the West Antarctic or Greenland ice shelves could produce sudden change with a slight increase in temperature. It may not. You may smoke 5 packs a day all your life and never get lung cancer and be shot by a jealous husband at age 95. Or you may get lung cancer without smoking, but you're increasing your risk. by smoking 5 packs a day, and we're increasing our risk by pouring so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Potential of energy helping cause, contributing to the cause of cataclysmic metastasis, essentially, of the ecosphere. We can do the same thing, have malignant problems with energy structures that we have laid down if we overload them and don't work them right. Take the electricity grid, please. 4 years ago, August storm, Branch Falls in Cleveland on some power lines within 9 seconds, 80 gigawatts of power were offline. 50 million electricity consumers in eastern Canada and northeastern United States. Now, we tried to take a leaf from the book of the South Park kids there and blame Canada. But the Canadians, in their polite way, pointed out to us that actually Cleveland is south of Lake Erie, not north. And we had to fess up to the fact that it was our power line. But that's not the only type of problem that we can have from energy. We can also have malevolent problems. Terrorists are a lot smarter than tree branches. They can get on the grid. They can understand the problems we have, particularly with the SCADA, the Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition Systems, and the vulnerabilities of the transformers in the grid. The SCADA systems, the firewalls that protect our SCADA systems probably have been improved recently. Before, they were probably vulnerable to your average 9-year-old hacker. Now you may need to be a pretty good 11-year-old hacker to get through them. But I guarantee you, any of the computer savvy in this room, of which it's probably about 99%, excluding only me, could do a very good job against our grid protecting software. We have a serious problem with the grid, but the grid is at least here. If we could get ourselves organized and to deal with the fact that we have 50 centers of authority in managing the electricity grid, not one, then we might be able to make some progress, but we haven't done it yet. And oil, on the other major energy system we need to deal with, oil, basically only 2% of our electricity comes from oil now, so I'm separating oil off from electricity. Oil dominates transportation. 97% of transportation fuel, one way or another, is oil. And the oil infrastructure is not here anymore very much. It's where the oil is, 2/3 of which is in the Persian Gulf and another several percent in the Caspian Basin, maybe close to 3/4 in that part of the world. So that's where the infrastructure is. What does that mean? That means when Al-Qaeda tried to attack Abqaiq 2 years ago, unfortunately for them, they rigged their truck bomb wrong. Had they rigged their truck bomb right, they could have taken out the sulfur clearing towers, which would have taken about 5 or 6 million barrels a day offline from the largest oil production facility in the world, would have sent oil easily up to bin Laden's target of $200 a barrel. And then there's the fact that we borrow between $1 billion and $1.5 billion a day, every calendar day now, to import oil. You're worried about the cost of the Iraq war. This dwarfs it. You're worried about the trade deficit with China. This dwarfs it. And you wonder what happens to the dollar when we ship $1 billion plus a day of IOUs abroad. Just look at its value. And you wonder perhaps where some of that goes. Well, since hundreds of billions go to the Middle East, hundreds of billions to Saudi Arabia alone, and since in the looming tower, Lawrence Wright, I think very accurately says that with about 1% of the world's Muslims, the Saudis control about 90% of the world's Islamic institutions. And since the Wahhabi doctrine, which they teach in all those madrasas in Pakistan, for example, is somewhere between murderous and genocidal with respect to Shiite Muslims, Jews, homosexuals, and apostates, and massively repressive of everyone else, including particularly women, when those little boys are being taught in the madrasas in Pakistan, they're being taught a doctrine that for all practical purposes is the same doctrine as Al-Qaeda's. It's just that the Wahhabis and Al-Qaeda disagree on who should be in charge, not like the Trotskyites and the Stalinists, not on the underlying doctrine. So if you want to know who's paying for those little Pakistani boys to be taught to have their greatest objective to be suicide bombers, next time you get out of the car to charge your gasoline, try to turn the mirror just a few inches So you're looking into your own eyes. Now you know. You and I are paying for those little Pakistani boys to learn to be suicide bombers. So we got a rather large array of energy problems, malignant and malevolent. In my judgment, we should stay alert in investment and in development, particularly to those technologies which can help with both malignant and malevolent problems. I've written something on this in the form of a dialogue on energy planning between a tree hugger and a hawk. The tree hugger is only concerned about carbon. The hawk is only concerned about terrorism. My tree hugger is the ghost of John Muir, and my hawk the ghost of George S. Patton. So in shorthand here, I'm going to say, in the last minute or so, what types of technologies I think would help both Muir's and Patton's concerns. First of all, energy efficiency, huge opportunities for reducing use of electricity there. We can talk about it in questions if you want. Second, breaking down a lot of the barriers that have built up over the years to not doing smart things with electricity. We want to go the way of California and a few other states in decoupling sales from earnings for utilities. We want to do a lot more cogeneration. Combined heat and power. Denmark gets a third of its electricity that way. We want to do a lot more, I think, distributed generation of both electricity and biofuels. Distributed suggests cellulosic and waste feedstocks as distinct from things like either corn-based ethanol or petroleum, which tend to come from relatively limited numbers of places. And I think we want to move decisively toward plug-in hybrid gasoline-electric vehicles and flexible fuel vehicles to use a range of biofuels, ethanol, methanol, butanol, waste feedstocks and the like, not solely ethanol from corn. There's one set of programs that appeals to Muir, but Patton doesn't like very much. And that's clean power plants of any kind. Sun, wind, nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration. Why does Muir like them? Because they're clean, of course. Why does Patton hate them? Because they add to the use of the grid. Patton says, look, I know the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line could at least be defended from one direction. The damn grid can't be defended at all the way we do it now. Patton likes coal to liquid. Muir, of course, hates it because it's very carbon producing. But I would suggest to you that if you look for overlaps, if you look for things that both Patton and Muir would be interested in, you are likely to be looking at promising technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Woolsey, for kicking us off. Our second speaker is someone who, as we usually can say, needs no introduction to this audience. Bob Metcalfe, as an MIT grad, has not just gained education here, but he has given back enormously to the education of others by being present in the community and a major stimulus of the community. In his present role, he is a general partner of Polaris Venture Partners, and from that perspective, as a venture capitalist, as an entrepreneur, I think he's going to give us some different points of view about today's topic. Bob?
And now for something completely different. I'm grateful that I only have 7 minutes because, I mean, how much can a mere internet tycoon say about energy? I want to start by saying how enthusiastic and proud of MIT I am in having formed this event, and how amazed I am that so many of you are still here on a Saturday afternoon. I also want to immediately apologize. I'm a hard-bitten entrepreneur, battle-scarred, and then for 10 years I was a professional smart aleck. So it's impossible for me to talk without being annoying. So if I annoy any of you, but in particular if I appear to disagree with anyone who has spoken in the last 2 days, I'm sorry, I misspoke, I didn't mean it. I got into energy in 2005 when President Hockfield said that MIT was going to do energy, and I got my brass rats. I said, okay, I'm going to do energy too. And so I went to Polaris, where I work, And we're a diversified venture capital firm, and I said, you know, let's diversify into those trillion-dollar poorly served markets. And my partner said, yes, let's go do that. And I have now 7 companies in my little portfolio, which during the Q&A you could ask me about, and it's my job to tout them to you. But then Ernie Moniz asked me to join the Energy Advisory Board to the Energy Initiative, which I did. And in order to have some standing, I've started a journalistic project, which looks like this. Let's take lessons from the 62 years of the construction of the Internet and apply them to how we should conduct the innovation process we're now engaged in for energy. So take Internet lessons and apply them to energy. I call this the Internet, to make the analogy. And so now I'm going to share with you a few results from that projection of lessons from the Internet onto the Internet. One quick lesson is that it matters how you look at the problem. If you realize that it's going to take, say, 62 more years to solve energy, 62 years, then the problem is no less urgent, but you approach it differently. For example, you're more humble. In 62 years, you're likely to be surprised. In 62 years, you're likely to be wrong. So you then conduct yourself differently. You set up processes that assume you might be wrong, that you might discover some surprises. In particular, you don't allow yourself to be paralyzed by hardening of the categories. In the Internet, in the beginning, there were computers, that was IBM, and there was communications, and that was AT&T, and the Justice Department regulated IBM, and the FCC regulated AT&T, and they actually had hearings to decide who is in charge of which of them because they were clearly completely separate and needed to be done. Well, we learned very quickly that computers and communications are the same thing, and that was a silly hardening of the categories then. Voice, video, and data were at one time inseparable. Television, telephone, and the Internet, they're now, well, they're becoming integrated by all becoming data. So we should be careful about hardening of the categories. The Internet also had some early surprises. For example, we began building the Internet by thinking everything was going to be centralized. There was a law called Grosch's Law that said bigger computers were better. And then Moore's Law came along and said little computers are better. And then Metcalfe's Law came along and said that connecting them together would be better. So our laws changed, our way of looking. That was surprising. Centralized was the wrong answer, but we started centralized. We also believed that we needed to conserve bandwidth. There was a huge multi-billion-dollar infrastructure of copper in the world that was limited to carrying a certain amount of bandwidth. So our first priority was conservation. So I ask you, after 62 years of building the Internet, do we use less bandwidth now than we did in 1946? No, we use 10 to the 10th, I don't know what the number is, it must be 10 to the 9th, 10th or 11th times more bandwidth now than we did at the beginning. There may be a lesson here for energy. In 62 years from now, the year 2070, are we going to be using less energy than we are now? Of course not. So, I've switched cars. I'm down to 4 cylinders. I'm planning to go to hybrid and all electric and all that stuff, but I don't think for a moment that we're going to conserve our way into solving this problem. And I learned that on the Internet. Now, do you want this to be a movement? The Internet was a movement. There was a time there on the Internet, the way you'd win an argument to somebody who disagreed with you is you'd say, you just don't get it, do you? So we were a movement. We were full of missionaries, and you've heard that word a couple of times today, the need to be missionaries and to believe in the movement. And that fills you with certainty and consensus and arrogance and propaganda and coercion and blaming the customers. The reason that we're not using compact fluorescent lights is because the consumers are stupid. And we need to educate them and build awareness, and the fact that they're full of toxic substances is irrelevant. Now, when you have a movement, you need to decide on the uniform. So I've been thinking a lot recently about what the right color is for our movement. And I've deduced from what I've heard today that we're kind of choosing green as our color, our team color. And Tom Friedman first alerted me to this mistake. You see, green stands for environmentalism, but the so-called greens are, let me see, anti-technology, anti-capitalism, anti-trade, anti-American. So do I want green to be my color? No. I'd recommend, I've been considering black, oil, coal, silicon. I've been considering blue, the sky and the oceans, but not green. I recommend that you choose your colors more carefully for this movement. I've also heard that we're going to go to Washington. We're all going to go to, some of us came from Washington, the rest of us are planning to go there soon. In the internet I saw this too. We went to Washington for the Build the Information Superhighway. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. You go to Washington, it's a pro-am, and we are the ams. The status quo, which we're trying to change, is dangerous and mean and tough. And they own Washington. So when you go there to get stuff, sometimes you get the wrong stuff. Like we just heard corn ethanol. The wrong feedstock, the wrong fuel. The only thing good about corn ethanol is that the money's going to the Midwest instead of the Mideast. You also get things like the Department of Energy. I mean, the last time you guys had the idea of going to Washington, we ended up with the Department of Energy. So the next time we go to Washington, could we just fix the Department of Energy first before we do anything new? We also developed policies in Washington that meant we haven't built any nuclear power plants for 20, 30 years. That was dumb, as you just heard. So be careful when you get the idea that you're going to go to Washington and fix this problem. You're not. Scale, the rant is almost over. So scale was appropriately chosen as a theme for this conference, and I'm not going to disagree that we need scale solutions, but be careful about demanding scale. One of the weapons of the status quo is to set high hurdles for innovations. And when they say, it's got to scale or we're not going to do it, what they do in Washington there is they get laws made that little technologies that are not evidently scalable are not allowed. They make rules, as they did for in the internet, that if you can't serve everybody, you can't serve anybody. Which meant you couldn't start small and kind of grow into your technology. You had to serve everybody all at once, and that's a too high a hurdle for new technology to reach. So watch out for that scale notion as a tool. In closing, you may remember there were some bubbles during the 62 years of the construction of the internet. I guess there was a famous couple of them toward the end there. The dot-com bubble, a telecom bubble. So bubbles are part of what we're doing. Global warming is a bubble. How do I know this? Well, during the internet bubble, Al Gore was prominent. Now, when the internet bubble was inflating, the internet was growing. And now that you're all consumed by the global warming bubble, there is global warming. I'm not denying that. I'm saying there is a bubble. And I'd like to point out that when we solve the global warming problem, which we could suddenly, that might be a surprise. We could do it with nanoparticles in the atmosphere. We can do it with Mylar at L1 between the Earth and the Sun. We could solve one volcano or a nuclear war. They could all solve global warming. But after we solve global warming, we would still have the energy crisis. We still need cheap and clean energy. And global warming may just be a transient bubble. I think it is. I also hasten to add that bubbles are good. So the internet bubble was a good thing, I think. The only people who don't think so are sore losers. Thank you.
A comment on the last word choice. You had to have been a loser before you had a chance to be sore about it. Winners, I think, weren't sore. There is one other comment I'd like to make based on what Bob was talking about before I introduce our final panelist, and that relates to the issue of scale. Those of us who study and teach about innovation know that one of the most significant barriers to innovating is to throw the scale question in front of the inventor or the entrepreneur. Because almost all startups are with ideas and with organizations that prima facie couldn't possibly scale the way they are, with whom they are, with what they're trying to do, and the like. And it takes significant evolution and development before you get to the point that you have something that actually scales. So pushing scale as a critical criterion up front is bound to assure that all of us will lose. With that, let me turn to our third panelist. And our third panelist has a quite different background and now a quite different foreground. His background includes a period of time at that place in Washington called the DOE, where he was the assistant secretary in charge of energy efficiency, not bad, and renewable energy, also not bad. And with that as background, he now is in charge of the Director of Climate and Energy for Google.org. Google.org, as opposed to Google.com, is the part of Google that is indeed trying to do important things for society per se, even potentially without making money based on it, at least not immediately. So we're delighted to welcome Dan Reicher as our third panelist.
Well, those are some tough acts to follow. I'm thinking maybe I should just walk down these stairs and walk out. Anyway, I'm very pleased to be here. I am the final act of the day, and I'm thinking back to Congressman Mo Udall, the famous congressman in Washington, had an eminent career on things green. And Mo used to look at the final witness after 18 of them and say, well, everything has been said, but not everybody has said it. Please proceed. So, speaking of Al Gore, I think there is a positive note to end up on today, which is indeed the business case for clean energy. I think we are looking at an amazingly interesting time going forward when it comes to energy. And I think this is sort of an upscale view from Yogi Berra. The future is not what it used to be. And if you think about where we've come in the last few years, $100 a barrel oil, the climate crisis, so many things that have happened that have pushed energy onto the national agenda, the international agenda, that have made it a key element of our national security, our economic security, of our environmental security. Energy is really become an amazingly important piece of our economy, our environment, our society generally. But I think there is great opportunity to talk about when it comes to energy. Some of the iconic images, this is the classic one. This is the one that I think perhaps represents how some people in our society think about where we've come today. This may be the more appropriate one. Now, this is a very personal one for me because I delivered my third child in a car at a Shell station in Vermont 5 years ago. I don't recommend it to any women in the audience. More on that later. This may be perhaps the most appropriate image. The Economist talking about the greening of America. Indeed, a compact fluorescent light bulb. The opportunity to merge economics, environment, security. And I think this is really where we're headed. And I think we are indeed looking at challenging times, but very exciting times as well. This is the way I think about the sustainable energy future that we're all looking at right now. I think too often we work towards a sustainable energy future in our narrow little categories. But I think these have got to be integrated. We've got to continue to move technologies forward. We've got to put smart policies in place at every level, international, national, regional, and local. And there's got to be adequate capital, literally trillions of dollars that we're looking at over the next couple of decades to fundamentally rebuild our energy infrastructure globally. Technology, policy, finance. We've taken a look at this at Google and asked ourselves, where could we have some impact? As a company, as a philanthropy, what could we do? And we've launched two initiatives. both last year. One we call renewable electricity cheaper than coal. We launched this. Google is indeed an engineering-based company, so we put it in a formula of RE less than C. The day after we launched it, the HTML programmers all wrote me and said, "How dare you use a less than sign?" It all messed up everything they were doing. But renewable electricity cheaper than coal. I think you all know this. This was the motivation. It really is quite astounding to say to someone in the public, renewable electricity, 2% of U.S. supplies, global renewable electricity, 2% non-hydro. People think we've come a much further distance than that. And this is the real problem. Renewables today cannot compete with coal. Photovoltaics, everybody's favorite, put them on your roof, 4 to 5 times more expensive than coal. Solar thermal, 3 times more expensive. Geothermal, twice as expensive. Wind, probably 25 to 50% more. We can't compete today with coal. And what we want to try to do, working with many others, is dramatically lower the price of renewable electricity and finally move it into mainstream, finally to be able to compete straight up with coal. So our goal is indeed to make renewable electricity cheaper than coal and to do it in years and not decades. We've set a narrower objective for ourselves, which is to build 1,000 megawatts of renewable electricity cheaper than coal, and to do it in a relatively short time frame, as we say, years and not decade, enough to power roughly the city of San Francisco. We actually almost announced we were going to make this 1.21 gigawatts. Anybody know why? Well, you remember Back to the Future? There's that great scene where the mad scientist says, "I need 1.21 gigawatts to power the flux capacitor of the time machine." There was a moment at Google when our press release actually read 1.21 gigawatts with a link to the movie. But the adults prevailed at Google and we're back to a gigawatt. So what are we doing about it? What are the elements of RE less than C? There are really 4 things: R&D, investment, policy, and information tools. And let me just quickly take you through what we're doing in each of those areas. We've made some investments to date. We're both investing in technology companies with really breakthrough technologies that can bring the cost of renewables down the cost scale quickly and help us indeed to get to scale. We're developing a larger pipeline of investments in technology companies. We're also looking for high-risk project investments, the so-called valley of death. You get an energy technology to the pilot scale, and so often they die. The investment community says, come back after you've built the first couple of projects and we'd love to invest. It's those first couple of projects, taking them through the valley of death, we want to be helpful there. Policy. Lots and lots of things that the policy community can be doing in Washington, in the states, internationally. We've heard a lot about tax credits in Washington, carbon cap and trade, lots of things that can happen. I want to focus quickly on 2. One, these are the climate change proposals that loom large in Washington. Lots of discussion. I think we are going to make progress there over the next couple of years. The big question is how steep a curve we're going to be on and over what period of time. And with that, a lot will be decided about the cost of renewable electricity. So I think we're making progress there. I can't say we're making progress when it comes to renewable energy. We have lost pretty much every vote in Washington over the last few years when it comes to federal support for renewable energy. The tax credit extensions, a national renewable electricity standard, transmission legislation, federal R&D, we are not really making the kind of progress there that we need to make. So we want to be sure we focus on energy legislation as well as climate legislation going forward. I'm not sure what this says about policy. Anybody take a look at this graph? I think if you're an MIT professor, you ought to put this out as an exam question for students to interpret. I'm going to leave it at that. We also are very interested in the world of information and information tools. What can we as Google do with our own tools? Google Earth, Google Maps, YouTube. Google Earth, for example, there's lots and lots of data available about renewable energy. How do we better collect it? How do we better display it? How do we better get it out to developers and financial people and technologies? Could we layer incentives and transmission on top of that renewable energy data to better indicate where the investment opportunities are? We're looking at that. What could YouTube do to really get the message out to policymakers in Washington? A lot of opportunities there. One quick example I wanted to highlight where we are indeed digging in, as it were, is engineered geothermal systems. We're very excited about this opportunity, a way to move an energy technology, a renewable energy technology forward that has gotten a lot less attention. You heard a little bit about this earlier today. Instead of drilling into pockets of steam or hot water, we want to exploit a much broader array of the Earth's heat at depth. And there's some interesting technologies to do that. They are beginning to move forward successfully. We could unlock a vast base of resources across the United States and globally. There's lots of technologies that could move this forward, and we think that we can see a great step forward in this way. So we're looking across these 4 areas at ways that we can have some impact in investment, in R&D, using our own tools, and in policy. Wrapping up, I just wanted to mention the other focus of ours, which is plug-in vehicles. Very interested in how we can move plug-in vehicles to scale and to do that very quickly. We've built a fleet of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. We're testing them. They plug into a very large solar array at the Google headquarters in Mountain View, so they're charging from the sun. Google employees are testing them. We're learning a lot about the real-world operation of plug-ins. And the data is up on our website at rechargeit.org. So pretty good mileage that we're seeing, even compared to the average Prius on the road today. We know we can put lots of vehicles on the road. We know there's adequate load for millions of vehicles if we charge them at night. There's also ways to make money with plug-ins, selling electricity back to the grid, so-called cash-back hybrids. We've done some experiments with that, sending electricity from these vehicles back to the utility. We also know there's ways that you could dampen out the intermittency of energy sources like wind through plug-in vehicles. So a lot of opportunity with plug-ins, and ultimately, in finishing up, we look for a day when, indeed, we're plugging millions and millions of vehicles into a greener grid, thereby moving renewables forward, thereby moving plug-ins forward, dealing with our energy security, our climate change problems, and making some money at the same time. So the future is not what it used to be. And as Alan Kay said, the best way to predict the future is indeed to invent it. This was what Royal Dutch Shell said a decade ago about where we might be in 2050. I think if we press that curve down through energy efficiency, bring these newer technologies to bear, lower their cost, and look for that technology called surprise that we know is out there, but we haven't developed yet, I think we have a wonderful future. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to open it up for audience questioning in just 1 minute. What I'd like to do is I'd like to give each of our other speakers a chance to see if there is an additional remark they'd like to make, having heard everybody else. Jim, do you have anything you'd like to comment on?
I want to say just one word about subsidies. I drive a plug-in Prius. A123 converted my Prius for me about 3 weeks ago, and I have photovoltaics on my roof and batteries in my basement, so I literally drive on sunlight now every day. So I'm not a good person to explain why this can't be done and it's just pie in the sky. I really think one needs to pay a great deal of attention to existing subsidies in calculating costs. Terry Tamminen, who advises Governor Schwarzenegger on these issues, says that the oil industry gets approximately $1 trillion a year in subsidies, direct and indirect, through the tax system and otherwise in the United States. And Boyden Gray, President Bush I's former White House counsel, currently ambassador in the EU, says that in only one area, aromatics, the subsidy from the United States government to oil is $250 billion a year. So when one is comparing the cost of driving from the rooftop with photovoltaics, as I do, and as people are increasingly beginning to do in California, one needs to calculate it not as against some hypothetical free enterprise provision of fossil fuels, but against what we really have. And it is very inconvenient to take your television set down to the coal-fired power plant to plug it in and watch South Park. Very inconvenient. You've got to calculate everything that happens, the transmission losses, the constructing the transmission lines, the distribution lines, the congestion losses, all the rest, before you do these comparisons. And when you do, I suggest to you, you're going to find that the renewables, particularly distributed renewables, are a lot closer than people think.
Bob, would you like to add a comment to your prior remarks?
I would. When I wisecracked about the Department of Energy, I hadn't noticed that Dan actually used to work there. And if I knew more about the Department of Energy, I probably would have a richer answer to this question. My particular gripe with the Department of Energy is that we need money at universities, research universities, to explore all these scientific topics we're talking about. And my gripe with DOE is it sucks up too much of that cash and doesn't give them to the universities, instead puts it into its own laboratories, which I submit are not an efficient use of research dollars. That's my gripe with DOE, not with anything that you were doing there when you were there.
Right. I'm certain not. Who would like to pose a question? We have about 8 minutes in which we can ask questions of the panel. Who'd like to throw one at them? Yes, go right ahead. Sure. Stand up so we can hear you well.
Yep. We talked a bit about the risk associated with the grid, and I'm wondering what drives development, or what has been driving development of centralized power, and what needs to change to accommodate maybe a distributed power generation model.
A much smarter grid could probably be a lot more resilient if we designed it right. The problem is that there are 50 grids, and that there's no single person or office in charge of, say, security for the grid. The closest is probably the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. But it's not clear who's in charge. And as a result, particularly when we went to deregulation several years ago to let there be a national electricity market, that was sort of a good idea in one sense, but the grid was not equipped to deal with it. And as a result, one has situations occurring like the crash of the grid in the Northeast that I described. We've overloaded the system and gotten a lot of the resilience out of it in the name of making power cheap, and we are in a very dangerous situation with the grid today.
Next question. Yes.
Hi, I was intrigued by Mr. Metcalfe's assertion that Greens hate capitalism and are un-American, I think it was. And I was wondering if you'd care to elaborate on that assertion, and also more generally hear from the panel as to whether you see environmentalists, self-identified environmentalists, as an obstacle or an ally in the drive for cleaner energy.
Well, my observations about Greens is partially a joke, but I'm sorry. Is it news to you that the Greens are anti-technology?
You mean the Green parties in Europe, right?
People who walk around saying we're the Greens are not people that I think have ideas that we should be pursuing hotly. Anti-technology, anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-free trade. These are the globalism people. Oh, and they tend toward violence in the end. You know, stay away from these people and choose a different color.
But there are Greens and there are Greens. You know, I think it's important, seriously, the national environmental organizations, there is a profound understanding, I think, in the environmental movement today, the mainstream environmental movement, that indeed technology is one of the major answers, that we've got to stimulate technology investment. So I understand this.
Well, let me make a comment on that.
Didn't we all laugh at the really funny joke about banana? Build absolutely nothing, blah, blah, blah. Well, isn't that sort of part of green?
Let me toss in a comment. There are a few people in this audience that maybe are as old as I am. But in 1971, I formed a company in conjunction with the environmental chemistry group at Boston College. And the company was formed, I was a system dynamicist. We were going to build environmental models that would be used to provide standards and analyses for new capital projects of state and federal government. We got our first 2 governmental contracts. We were moving forward, and then came 1973. Now, some of you may not know what happened in 1973, but others of us here remember it as the year of the OPEC embargo. And during a period of 2 years, oil prices tripled. That's even more impressive than what's happened in the last couple of years. And what I will tell you is that my company, which was called Environmental Impact Center, how green can you be, could not get another contract relating to environmental work because no one cared anymore. And yet, it was very easy to begin focusing on the problems of energy. Fortunately, the president of the company was an environmental chemist and managed to realize that the company could be saved by turning to the National Science Foundation and beginning to get battery research and development contracts. And the company continues today as EIC. No one remembers what it stood for originally. But there is inevitably a trade-off, at least in the short run, between environmental priorities and energy priorities. And I think that the issue becomes one at some point in time of deciding, are you going to pick an extreme on one side or the other, or are you going to try to balance the trade-off some places in the middle? I can imagine that different people in this room will elect to position themselves at very different places along that spectrum. And I think that Bob's comment about the Greens, particularly in Europe, is one of those positioning statements about what a whole series of ideas fit into, and one could make a statement maybe about the blues or the reds or what have you.
Can I take issue with
Sure.
what you said? Go on the website of Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, Amory Lovins' outfit in Colorado. The energy savings programs that they talk about, and McKinsey in a more limited way did too last year, cut huge amounts of electricity use out using projects and buildings around the world that have 10% or better internal rate of return. They make money. Amory says that much of the discussion about the trade-off between energy and environmentalism, people have the order of magnitude of the funds involved right, they just have the sign wrong. You make money instead of losing it by doing smart things environmentally. I'd commend the RMI website to you.
I think that maybe we'll take one last question here, and then we're going to have to call it a day, unfortunately.
Thank you. There is no question that we need subsidies to get from here to there. Solar, wind, and geothermal, etc., they're all not economically viable today, even though we all can see our way, perhaps rightly or wrongly, and time frame may be different depending on how our learning curve goes. My question is that I have heard from you and other people that subsidies are difficult, and I know they're difficult, but what is your other option if not subsidies, and perhaps can we manage them better?
I'm not opposed to subsidies and tax credits. I think is the right formation to bring some of these new technologies online. What I don't want forgotten is that the existing systems, coal and oil, have huge subsidies behind them. And that by getting rid of a number of existing subsidies, one would probably give things like solar a much better shake. But if one wants to accept the current existence of the fossil fuel subsidies of all sorts of direct and indirect sorts that have built up over the course of the last century, then in order to move promptly to have solar, wind, geothermal, etc. in the system, one is going to have to find ways to give them tax credits and the like. Today in California, power purchase agreements are being signed by energy supply companies with new shopping centers, let's say, which beat with photovoltaics, admittedly with the tax credits, but beat the price of electricity from the grid in California, 15 cents a kilowatt hour, beat it with 12 cents a kilowatt hour. You already have grid parity in California from photovoltaics if you take account of the tax credits from the federal and state subsidies to solar. But it's not as if the other things, nuclear has subsidies from insurance being guaranteed and so forth. A lot of energy has subsidies. If you're going to be fair, you've got to figure out what all the subsidies are, and in order to move forward with the environmentally sound things, I think you're going to have give them things like tax credits too.
Let me just add that.
Dan, we have a hard close 2 minutes ago.
Okay. Let him finish. Let him say it.
Well, yes? Okay, all right. The operators say yes. Go ahead, Dan.
I've got 1 minute and 15 seconds left now.
No, minus.
I just wanted to add that one of the major differences between the renewable energy and energy efficiency subsidies and the traditional energy subsidies is the traditional energy subsidies tend to be permanent ones. They are on the books. What we have to go back to Washington every couple of years and do is get renewable energy subsidies reauthorized. And that really is not a level playing field. So there's both the magnitude of the subsidies, which differ greatly, and there's the fact that the ones that we're looking for to help move these clean energy technologies into greater use are on again, off again. And that's really hurt the development of the renewable energy and energy efficiency industry. Exactly. So hopefully that can change with the new Congress and a new administration.
I've got the last word on this panel, and that is to first thank the panelists for their contribution to trying to wrap up and finish up this conference with challenge to everyone here. And secondly, to thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence, your participation, and for what we hope is going to be a stimulated takeaway for all of you that is going to enrich the further development of all of the problem solving that we want to move forward from this conference. Thank you all.